we don't want to keep you longer than that if possible. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Obviously, it's an issue of great concern, I think, to everybody in the northeast of England at the moment, and that's why we decided to postpone the original topic of conversation that we were going to be having this evening, which had been an introduction to management planning, and instead talk about the impacts of Storm Arwen on trees, woods and forests in the area. We've got a number of us here this evening to speak to you, and we anticipate talking for about 20-25 minutes, something like that, and then allowing a good amount of time for questions and answers at the end. Will, perhaps if you could just go on to the next slide, please. So just to let everybody know, as I said to those of you who joined earlier on, please just leave your microphone on mute so that we're not interrupted as we go along anyway. If you can use the chat function to ask any questions, for those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, the chat function can be found by moving your cursor to the base of your screen, and you'll find along the bottom there a number of icons, including one that says chat, and if you click on that, then it then opens up a little box in which you can type your question. We will then ask those at the end, or come to you to ask those at the end. We'll ask you to unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself if you want to, or if not, we can do it for you. And finally, we'll just be recording this webinar and making it available online on YouTube, probably at a later stage, so please just bear that in mind this evening. So, right, I'm just making sure there's nobody else waiting to come in, but I don't think there is, so thank you for that. Thanks, Will. So just a little bit first about the overall project, just very briefly. Those of you here last week will know all this anyway, but the webinar we're running this evening is part of the Woodland Management Focus Area Pilot Project, which was funded by the Forestry Commission through the Woods into Management Forestry Innovation Fund. And what we're doing in the project is using GIS to identify clusters or focus areas of unmanaged woodlands, and all sorts of reasons for managing unmanaged woodlands, as we talked about last week. Hopefully most of you are aware of that by now. Also running a woodland webinar program, which this is one, as we say, it's an extra, and then providing landowner support and advice in those focus areas, and then finally also an evaluation of the woodland status against the United Kingdom Forestry Standard, which, if you join us for some of our later webinars, we'll talk more about that. Thank you all. Just in terms of the speakers this evening, in addition to myself, we've got Will Richardson, who's a director of RDI Associates, Richard Pow, the Partnership and Expertise Manager at the Forestry Commission for Yorkshire and the North East area, and hopefully Cameron Smith, who's the Director of Operations for Euroforest Central Region. Cameron is, like everybody in the forestry sector at the present moment, out on the road trying to assess the extent of damage and impact, and therefore we're not absolutely sure he'll be able to join us this evening. But if he can, he will come in later anyway to talk to us about the impact. Euroforests are one of the largest harvesting businesses in the UK, so obviously have a great deal to contribute. Thank you all. So just a summary of the webinar. These are the things we're going to be talking about this evening. Firstly, the impacts, just a very quick look at that. What the priorities might be in terms of site clearance and timber harvesting, and then a little bit talk about what the impacts might be on timber quality and markets for timber, plant health implications, some sources of information and advice and things to be talking or thinking about in that respect, and then some questions and answers, hopefully. So say, just bear in mind, if you do have any questions, then do please put them in the chat function. So. We have just been joined by Cameron, so thank you very much, Cameron, for joining this evening. That's very good of you to do that. Right, okay, so in terms of Storm Arwen, the impacts, well, I think just firstly to say that it is still early days in terms of working out what the impacts are, and they are subject to further assessment. In the forestry sector, what will be happening is that next week a number of satellite images will be looked at to compare those with images from before the storm, to compare like with like. And as you can see from this slide here, from a satellite image, it will be fairly apparent what the extent of the damage is. And after that, we'll be able to work out with some more precise detail actually what the sort of area affected was, the area of damage, or the amount of damage within those areas, and what the possible volumes of timber have been. However, what we know so far is that, and I'm sure a lot of you will know this first point, in terms of the greatest impact, it's been across Aberdeenshire, the borders, Northumberland and Cumbria. Storm Arwen came from a northeasterly direction, came down across the east coast and then swung across through Cumbria. What was quite unusual about Storm Arwen was not only, in fact, the severity of the winds, but also the direction that they came from. And what that meant is that a lot of trees and structures which weren't used to winds from that direction and might have been wind firm if the same strength wind had come from, say, the southwest. That wasn't the case. So it has caused damage in all sorts of places and to an extent that we wouldn't necessarily have expected. What we do know from our initial estimates, and I should say that these really are just from, people driving around, having a look, some quick phone calls and emails and these sorts of things, is that at least 50% of the woodlands in those areas affected have significant damage in them. And there will be some areas, some woodlands, of course, which have far more than that, in many cases, 100% damage. But most woodlands have got, sort of in excess of 50% damage. The estimates so far are telling us that somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million cubic meters of timber have been blown over as a result of the storm. Now, what does that mean? For perhaps those of you who aren't that familiar with sort of timber terms and the like, well, every year in the UK, we harvest about 11 million tonnes of timber. Last year, it was 10.8 million tonnes. And a tonne of timber, for all intents and purposes tonight, is the same as a cubic metre, really. They're virtually the same. So you can tell from that sort of between about 15 and 20% of our annual harvest has blown over in the space of 12 hours or so. And clearly, that's very significant. And in the areas affected in itself, it will be more than that in terms of proportion. Just to put that into a bit of context, the 1987 storm, which many of you will remember, which affected southeast England, that actually caused about 3.9 million cubic meters of timber to be damaged. So probably about twice as much has happened in Storm Arwen. And since the sort of 1950s, something like that, there have been 4 or 5 other storms of similar sort of damage extent in terms of quantity of timber affected. Where about in the region of sort of 1.5 to 2.5 million tonnes of timber affected each time. And it seems that they happen about every 10 to 15 years on average, somewhere in the British Isles, very roughly speaking. So the last one of any great extent was in 2013, which affected mostly southern England on that occasion. And it was a very similar amount of timber blown over. So, yes, things are bad, but, this isn't unprecedented. And obviously the last point there is just also extensive damage to trees outside woodlands, which are not included in any of those estimates, but, equally severe in their impact. So thank you, Will. And the next one, please. So just in terms of priorities, clearly, individuals' priorities will change. We will differ depending on your own circumstances and situations, but we would suggest that these are some things worth thinking about. Firstly, health and safety, and we'll talk about that more later. Now, I mean, health and safety, of course, has perhaps arguably got a bit of a bad name for itself in recent years, but really, on this occasion, I make no apologies whatsoever for putting this at the top. We'll talk a bit more about this later on, but trees that have burned over are incredibly dangerous. Most of us in the forestry sector know people that have lost their lives or been severely damaged trying to deal with the clear up. And really, it is not worth trying to do something that you are not experienced and competent to do. So please do bear that in mind. The next priority, and a lot of you will already be through some of these stages anyway, and we've all heard about all the problems with power cuts for many people for a very long time. Power lines, public highways, private accesses, internal roads are going to be the next sort of list of priorities for people. Nature conservation and timber quality, I've put those there. We'll be talking a little bit more about timber quality later on, but I've just included nature conservation just to bear in mind that don't think you have to automatically go in and clear up absolutely everything. We all know that nature likes a bit of disorganization. trees falling over, a bit of dead wood is a great habitat for wildlife of all sorts in many cases. So unless something is immediately dangerous or causing a problem in some way, just think about, do I actually need to clear that up? You know, can I leave it there for the moment? If it's not dangerous, if it's not causing a problem, it may well be of some wildlife value in itself. So I'm going to pass over to Will now for him to talk about the next stage. And
thanks, Martin.
On.
That's great. Thanks very much. As Martin introduced me, I'm Will Richardson. I'm a chartered forester as well. I'll just get a few outline points, some things that hopefully are useful pointers in all of this. I'll hopefully be able to bring Cameron in to talk more about timber quality, markets, harvesting side, and then Richard from the Forestry Commission to pick up on regulation and plant health as well. So we often mention wind blow, but there's also wind snap. So the tree just literally snaps. They can affect timber qualities, the trees in different ways. We'll pick up on that in the next few minutes. We'll look at machines versus motor manual in terms of your clear up and how you deal with this. And as Martin said, we're not apologising for this at all. Health and safety, absolutely key. So in terms of site clearance and timber harvesting, health and safety, we're putting it at the top of the pile. There is good information, advice and guidance out there for woodland owners to refer to. And FISA, the Forest Industry Safety Accord, are kind of our lead safety body for our industry, set up in response to our safety record and trying to improve it, protect our workforce. And there's good advice out there. The general guide to managing health and safety in forestry is freely available off their website, and it sets out roles and responsibilities in terms of what the roles and responsibilities would be of the landowner in terms of clearing up and cutting timber. If you employed an agent or a forester, what their roles would be in terms of a forest works manager, and then the contractor's roles and responsibilities and all this. And I would strongly advise anybody to look into that and get that information. Like I say, they provide training, guides and advice, and it's well worth visiting their website. They also have good advice on the use of machines and chainsaws in forestry more generally, but they have a specific guide on the use of chainsaws for wind-blown clearance. Again, I'd strongly advise referring to that, looking at that. It highlights the dangers, the risks involved, and talks about safe working practices. But wherever possible, and this is where your forest works managers, your contractors would advise mechanical use of machines to do the clear up. A man working in a cab, a person working in a cab is far safer than somebody out in the wood with a chainsaw. You can't tell. I mean, often it is obvious where tension and compression is in the tree, but often you can't be 100% sure. And it is an incredibly risky operation to go into a large area of wind blow, trying to cut it up manually. So that's our focus on health and safety there. Like I say, some great advice, great information out there for you to follow. I want to talk about next is timber quality and markets. And Cameron, if I might bring you in at this point to perhaps pick up on some of these points I've set out in this slide. I'll just go through them quickly. Quality of timber will degrade the longer it's down, particularly if the tree is dead or dying. And obviously, like I mentioned, increased compression and tension in the wood. Once that's cut, or you try and cut it or harvest it, can lead to cracking and splitting. Again, will degrade the value of the timber over time. Sawmills, obviously, they look for fresh felled, high quality logs. That's what they want. So, the longer you're leaving your wood in the forest, the higher the chance that timber will degrade and have that effect on the quality. And as that quality is degraded, the timber starts to dry out, and you may be just restricted to things like biomass markets. I don't know, Cameron, if you're there, if you can pick up on any of those points for us.
I think you've summarised it well there. Well, what I would say, and you touched on this earlier on, there are fundamentally two different types of wind blow. We have snap and we have wind blow, where the root plate overturns but stays attached to the ground, stays in contact with the ground. And in terms of speed of reaction, then wind blow in a Sitka spruce plantation can stay there quite happily for a year or so before it really starts to show any times of any signs of decay. However, a Scots pine plantation that has snapped will need a very quick response to it. But overall, I mean, what will determine speed of response is the legislative process, and that will be something perhaps Richard will touch on earlier. But as I see it, then a snapped pine tree or a plantation of pine trees, all our trees that have snapped, you've got clearance to go ahead and clear that without license. But again, perhaps Richard can confirm that later. Whereas Sitka spruce or any tree still in touch with the root plate may need further assessment. Now, in terms of the sawmills, you're quite right. They want fresh felled timber. Pine, again, harping back to that, will start to show signs of deterioration after about 6 months. That's not necessarily the timber quality, but blue stain is a factor that will creep in. And that is not something that the sawmills want to see. It doesn't mean that the timber is degrading, but the visual appearance of it does. I would also, just at this point in time, reiterate, you've both touched on health and safety, and wherever possible, windblown sites must need to be cleared with mechanized harvesters. There are so many complications using chainsaw. Operators and landowners need to be aware that they have legal responsibilities to manage and minimize the risk to operators, and I've no doubt that there will be a raft of white van men patrolling the area offering the services. So please tread with caution. There's a structure in place. The Forest Works manager is key to that, and please don't underestimate your responsibilities in that respect. Markets for windblown timber, again, if it's cleared quickly and the timber is blown as opposed to snap will inherently mean that the timber is fractured, or the saw logs can be fractured. That's going to impact on the value that you can recover. And ultimately, if that sits unattended to for any length of time, as in, I mean, this time of year, it's not too bad, but once you start to get into the springtime, then timber will start to dry out and degrade very quickly. And then at that point, your markets are limited fundamentally to biomass and chipwood. So act quickly, but plan and don't underestimate the health and safety responsibilities.
Thanks very much, Cameron, for that. Hopefully you can join us for a wee bit longer and take any specific questions that might relate to those topics. Well, that's great. Thank you so much. So moving on, we'll hand over to Richard, if we may, to cover plant health and further information about felling licenses and restocking. Over to you, Richard. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Will. If you don't mind, I'll deal with the regulatory aspects, particularly felling license regulations first, and then I'll come on to the tree health issues. Perhaps because that's the order that I think about them, but perhaps that's the order that everyone ought to be thinking about these things. So I'll try and keep this as clear and simple as possible with respect to the regulations. And I say I'll try and keep it as clear as possible. The reason I say that is that there is not a specific exemption in the 1967 Forestry Act, which is what provides us with the felling license regulations. There's no specific exemption in that act for windblow. But there are a number of other exemptions that can be drawn on to effectively and legally deal with windblow. I'll mention two in particular as being the most relevant. One is in situations where that tree is dangerous. So if a tree is hung up, for example, and it's over a public right of way, or even if it's in a woodland in which public access is welcomed, you could fell that without the need for a felling license. And you should, subject to all the safety issues that we've been discussing, you should crack on with that. You shouldn't wait for permission from the Forestry Commission to fell anything that's dangerous. You as the landowner, or if you're not the landowner has a liability issue that you need to address. And I don't know whether liability is something we're going to discuss, but it's important to recognise the liabilities that all landowners have. And even though you can insure against those, it's incumbent upon any responsible landowner to deal with dangerous things on their land, in particular where there's an immediate danger as a result of the public being invited to a place in normal circumstances. Dangers increased as a result of a storm, for example. So the dangerous. The second issue is dead, or I'm going to rephrase that a little bit and call it no longer growing. Now, the purpose of the Act originally was to preserve a strategic reserve of growing timber. So if one bears that in mind, if a tree is blown over, the root plate is uprooted, 2/3, perhaps 3/4 of the roots are in the air, even though that tree is not going to die straight away, and as Cameron said, it kind of won't spoil for several months, it's not effectively adding increment. It's not, in layman's terms, it's not growing, even though it might not be dead at that point. So in situations where a coop is blown completely flat, you're exempt from the requirements of a felling license. Equally, if you're dealing with apically dominant species, so conifers, for example, and they're snapped at 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 meter height, there is no canopy, there is no needles, they cannot photosynthesize, so they can't grow. So in effect, you can deal with wind snap trees, even if you're not going to draw on the exemption related to those trees being dangerous. They may well be dangerous as well, of course. So hopefully that gives you reassurance that blown flat, not growing, you can clear them without a license. Snap trees, certainly in the case of conifers, not growing, you can clear without a license. However, you need to be a little bit careful, because very often what happens in a windblow scenario is that you will have many standing trees within a crop that's largely windblown, or you might have 2/3 of a compartment blown, but a third still standing, but no longer wind firm. Now, any trees that are still standing, because they're neither immediately dangerous and they're not dead, dying, and they are still growing, they are subject to the felling license regulations. So you would need a felling license. So in practical terms, what we're encouraging people to do is, in most situations where some or even most of an area is blown, so an area of a whole woodland, if it's a small farm woodland, for example, or most or all of a compartment, and the practical way to manage that going forward is to fell it all and replant it, then do apply to us for a felling license to fell it all. That'll be a conditional felling license, and the condition of that license will be that the area is replanted with an appropriate mix. So that's the way to deal with it. I just want to mention one other thing in terms of the regulations. So forestry is subject to environmental impact assessment regulations, and there's 4 types of forestry project that are subject to those regulations. Afforestation, i.e. creating new woodland on land that's previously non-wooded. Deforestation, i.e. removing a forest or woodland entirely. Creating roads, or creating quarries within a woodland. So we'll just narrow down on the deforestation one. So whilst felling trees and windblow per se are out of scope of the EIA regulations, if a woodland blew flat and then the landowner thought, well, I'm not going to replant this, I'm going to convert this into a field, I'm going to grow potatoes on it instead, or whatever they intend to do, that would constitute a land use change. That would be deforestation. So you would be therefore liable to or you'd be exposed to the full force of the environmental impact assessment regulations. Yeah. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. Because I think there is a risk. We recognise that there's a risk that we could lose forest area as a result of wind throw events, but there is some protection in terms of protecting that resource going forward in the shape of the deforestation aspect of the EIA regulations. Okay. TPOs and conservation areas. TPOs and conservation areas are administered by local authority. The Forestry Commission doesn't have a direct involvement with those. As far as I'm aware, it's not our legislation, it's local authority legislation, but as far as I'm aware, if a tree is blown down that has a tree preservation order on it, there is in effect no tree left to preserve. And I would imagine you would be therefore within your rights to clear it. But, and there is a big but, check with your local authority. Let them know that the tree that had a TPO on it has blown down, you're wanting to clear it up. The chances are they'll say carry on, but they might say, oh, we'll send an officer out to have a look at it. And perhaps we can talk to you about how that might be replaced, for example. The same applies in conservation areas. Conservation areas are a kind of area-based designation made by a local planning authority. They sometimes include trees or woodland. They often relate to heritage value in terms of built heritage value. But trees within conservation areas are subject to the same kind of regulatory control by the local authority as TPO trees are. So the same kind of rule and process applies if you happen to be within a conservation area. I don't know whether you want me to talk about forest consultants, contractors. That's perhaps for you, Will. But I can return to the tree health item if now's the right time to do it. So yeah, as it says here, we're faced with an increasing number of pests and disease in the UK. I won't go into all the reasons for that, but climate change and more trade in plant material over the last couple of decades are the main reasons for it. In terms of windblow and tree diseases, it's an interesting one. On the one hand, retaining some deadwood, as Martin mentioned earlier on, is a really good thing. In fact, it's a requirement of UK Forestry Standard good practice, and certainly a requirement of UK Woodland Assurance Standard to have some deadwood. It's a really important habitat and will increase the biodiversity of the woodland. However, you can have too much. And the risk is, if you were, for example, not to clear an area of windblow for a considerable period, you are in effect developing a large resource of stressed trees and decaying wood, and that could form a very, very habitable breeding ground for a number of pests and diseases. The message here really is that if you want to minimize your exposure to tree diseases, minimize the stress that the trees are exposed to. So right trees, right site, managed in the right way, healthy trees, strong natural resilience to pests and diseases. That's the kind of general rule of thumb. So the converse also applies. If you have loss of stressed trees, damaged or dead trees, you're likely to attract a lot of disease. And there's particular issues, for example, Ips topographers, which is a beetle affecting spruce that we found in the southeast of England. It would be awful if, as a result of folk not clearing windblow up for years, we create a breeding ground for a tree disease such as that, which could have major impacts on the forest industry in this country. So it is important that you're mindful of tree disease aspects when thinking about the management of windblow. I think I've probably, yeah, I think I've probably covered everything on there. Will, if that's
Thanks
right.
very much.
Unless there was anything else you were expecting me to say.
No, that's great. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. That's excellent. No, I'm sure there will be some follow-up questions. So yeah, just to sort of finish things off, obviously Richard just mentioned on this slide about information advice. If you're unsure, you know, there are forestry consultants, contractors that would definitely offer advice to you. In addition, there's local authority woodland officers who can advise on TPO and conservation area issues, and woodland officers at the Forestry Commission as well, a wealth of knowledge about felling licence requirements and the other element that Richard mentioned about environmental impact assessment. So there is plenty of advice out there. What if I may add to what Richard said is keep evidence, keep notes, keep photos, keep a record of what's happened to your wood. So if there is ever any you know, follow up on what you've done, you have a record, you have evidence, you've taken notes, photographic record of before and after, so to speak. And just one other thing on pests and diseases, when you do come to restock, you know, you may find you'll get deer moving in, particularly in large areas. And deer are inherently a problem for us in terms of how we regenerate, restock our woods. And it is a bit of a battle. So it's just one to monitor, one to look out for as well in that. So it's really down to a question and answer session now. So if I can hand back to Martin to monitor the chat function or the raised hand function, I think we can do that as well. Then yeah, please let us know the questions.
Could I just add one more thing that I feel I should mention, because Cameron touched on this. You know, we're aware that there will be a peak in felling licence applications as a result of Storm Arwen, because even though, as I described, there are some exemptions, in many cases people will be coming to us for felling licence. They'll also be coming to us for advice. You know, do I need a felling licence or not? Or what do you think is the best way to manage this woodland going forward? I feel we've responded to that quite quickly in that we're interviewing just next week for some more woodland officers. We're also drawing on what we call agency woodland officer capacity. So we've recently invited expressions of interest from those with relevant forestry background and qualifications to step forward and go on a list of agency woodland officers that we could draw on. We've had a reasonably high level of interest in that. So I'm hoping by the time we get to January, February, we will have more capacity in Yorkshire and the North East, and the same is largely true in Cumbria, to be able to respond to this this peak in felling licence applications, because we absolutely recognise that Cameron was saying that wood's a perishable product, and particularly with things like snapped pine, blue stain issues. You've got, many cases they'll be exempt, but in a lot of cases, if it's a grey area, people will submit a felling licence application, and we need to raise our game to process those as quickly as we can. Now, as part of that, we're currently exploring whether we might make some exemptions for the normal requirement to put details of felling proposals on the public register for 28 days. So for those that don't know, as a result of a ministerial directive that was made many years ago, the Forestry Commission enables local people to have a say in terms of woodland creation projects or felling proposals by sharing the basic details on this register of felling and planting. And it's been recognised that in the case of tree health, where you need to get things down quickly, it would actually be a good idea to perhaps not do that if the felling was absolutely inevitable. And the same thinking is currently being applied to windblow. So we've not taken any final decisions on that, but just to provide a little bit of reassurance that we're looking at that as part of our thinking in terms of, how can we make things easier for those that are having to deal with windblow.
Thank you, Richard. That was great. I think perhaps just one thing I would like to add, and it was something which somebody said in a meeting last week, and in a way is obvious, but worth repeating it, is that, of course, just because we have all this timber on the ground doesn't mean that there are any more harvesters than there were 2 weeks ago, or the markets are any different in that sense. And Cameron and his colleagues and what have you will be, transferring capacity over from planned harvesting operations to windblow over the next few weeks. So I think there is a need to sort of bear that in mind and just being patient to some extent. But also just think about that perhaps if you have got harvesting operations planned over the next few months of areas which haven't been affected by windblow, you might want to think about delaying those now, notwithstanding any issues, sort of contractual issues, felling license issues, those sorts of things. But just bear that in mind in terms of availability of contractors and the impact on markets that might have anyway. So anyway, Cameron might want to comment on that a bit later on, but we've got a couple of questions, 3 or 4 questions, so we'll just ask those. First one is from Wilf Lewis. Wilf, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question, which I think is mainly for Richard. It's around felling licenses and environmental impact assessments. Are you there, Wilf? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you fine. Thank you very much.
Excellent. On what scale do things like felling licenses and environmental impact assessments start sort of having an effect? Because you said that if a whole woodland had blown down, for example, if you then didn't replant, you'd still have to go through sort of all of the assessment for whether that's okay. But that if you had one individual tree that had blown down, then taking that out and not replacing it would be fine. And if you ignore the fact that we've had a storm for a moment, presumably thinning woodland and taking out 1 or 2 is not subject to regulation.
Yes.
Kind of where's the border between one tree and a whole wood?
Yeah, very happy to provide some details on that. I mean, chapter and verse is in a handy little booklet that you can access via the Forestry Commission gov.uk pages. There's a really useful booklet called it's called something like Felling Trees Getting Permission. Perhaps one of my colleagues could find it and put a link to it in the chat even. But that will provide you with the details. But to try and summarize, just to give you the kind of basics. So without the need to apply for a felling license, any landowner or their agent is allowed to fell up to 5 cubic meters of timber in any calendar quarter. Yeah, so you might say, well, how many cubic meters are there in a tree? It's very variable. It could be 10 little ones, it could be 1 very big one, but 5 cubic meters. However, if you're going to sell that timber, that limit is reduced to 2 cubic meters. And it's kind of pitched that level to allow farmers and landowners to fell the odd tree, to deal with small scale stuff on farms and small estates without the need to come to us for a felling license for every little thing. So that's the basic kind of scale issue in terms of felling license regulations. In terms of the environmental impact assessment regulations, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because it's about understanding what potential impact that deforestation could have on the environment. And so the impact will depend on how sensitive a location that deforestation is in, what kind of woodland you're deforesting, and what's the environmental value attached to that, and a number of other factors. So it's very difficult to give a simple answer. You will find various tables with various different thresholds, but in essence, anyone that's minded to do some deforestation, i.e. to remove a forest or woodland or part of a forest and woodland and convert it to, for example, agricultural land, would be well advised to contact the local woodland officer and just check whether in doing so they're not going to fall foul of the environmental impact assessment regulations.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Will. Next question from Mike Lewis. Mike, if you're still there and want to unmute yourself and ask your question. Is Mike there? Perhaps not. Mike's question, if I just ask it on his behalf, Mike's question was about the biomass market. He's saying, what is the biomass market? I'm not quite sure whether he sort of meant just to describe it or what the impacts might be, but perhaps, Will, you might want to say something. We've also got Neil Harrison from Reheat on the line. I think Neil might want to come in a minute, and perhaps Cameron as well, just briefly. Will?
Yeah, it's energy wood. Let's call it energy wood. Energy wood that will go into the energy generation market, whether that's electricity or heat generation, and it tends to take lower grade timber, so small diameter wood. Might be thinnings. It might be also brash as well. It does vary, but yeah, I don't know if Cameron would be able to add to that.
That pretty much covers it, Will. It is at the lower end in terms of value. So to start with the league of value, if you like, the trunk of the lower trunk of the tree, the butt, is higher value, saw log material going into construction. Midsection tends to be more fencing and pallet wood, and then down to the biomass market or chipwood market, which however you want to term it. The chipwood market is going into particle board. Biomass tends to be lower grade than that even, and it just hoovers up everything else that's left, and it is going into the energy market. So that pretty much covers it, I think.
Yeah. What sort of prices and?
Yes, we can hear you, Mike.
Hello.
Yes.
What sort of prices?
For biomass?
Yeah.
A lot depends on location. There isn't one fixed price, but I would put a ballpark delivered price of low 40s at this moment in time. That's delivered, but how that actually impacts on the woodland owner depends on location, haulage, distance to mill, etc. But the delivered in price, it would be in the low 40s at this moment in time. £40.
That's great.
That is, yeah.
That's great. Thanks.
And perhaps also just worth thinking, whilst we're on the subject of biomass, of course, is not forgetting firewood. You know, particularly if it's a hardwood crop, which is, you know, can be particularly valuable in a local context. Although I think that's particularly relevant what Cameron was saying earlier on about there being lots of white van men hanging around probably in the coming months, and you know, a market that could be particularly prone to that. But I don't know whether Neil from Reheat is able to join us. I think he was going to be driving at the time.
Give it a try, Martin. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Right, okay, I'll try and keep it brief. Not known for that, but I'll try and keep it brief because of the road noise. It's not pleasant for anybody. I think it's important to understand what's come down and where it's going to end up. And biomass markets, if we're talking about wood chip boilers, typically favour softwood. Hardwoods can create problems. Hardwoods also tend to be a bit bigger and harder to deal with in terms of breaking them down into bits that will fit into a chipper. So you might find that it's quite difficult to find any easy market for some of the bigger hardwood trees that I know have come down. Also, a lot of the stuff that I've seen that's failed, kind of a constant stream of stuff coming in on WhatsApp, is stuff that's actually been quite badly diseased. So hollow trees, that kind of thing. So that really, you're going to struggle to find meaningful markets for that will pay anything sensible. I think just because of the sheer quantity of damaged timber on the ground, we will see the price for biomass sort of suppressed. But I would look for aggregators as a potential market. So in Northumberland, you've got companies like Woody Fuels that are based just north of Alnwick at Rock. You've got the Estover plant just down at Cramlington. So look for the kind of bigger markets that are buying year round, because a lot of this material is going to be coming out and not necessarily in time for this year's heating season. And it's not going to be dry enough to be burned in biomass boilers. So there's a bit of thinking required around which markets you aim for and trying to optimize that price. And in terms of firewood, yeah, there's a couple of generations of firewood on the ground, certainly in my bit of Northumberland. So find not a white van man who thinks he can come and chop this stuff up for you. find a proper contractor who can do that, perhaps bring in processor machinery like sort of cone splitters and firewood processors to do it safely, and perhaps leave you with a nice pile of split firewood that you can season and sell into next year's market or the year after even. So that's just a couple of thoughts.
Right, thank you very much, Neil. Much appreciated. Safe driving. Right, if we move on to Mark Richmond. Mark, are you still there? And if you are, unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. Just had various questions. One was around, you mentioned about using mechanization, but I think one of you also mentioned, all of these harvesters, there's a lack of harvesters, and they're probably fairly well committed next year. So it's an easy thing to say, oh, we'll get a harvester in to clear this, but in the areas where we're affected, there isn't the capacity. And I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that. And so linked to that, could you just expand a bit more on about priorities? You said, for example, that Scots pine that had snapped would be the first things to degrade, so aim for them first, whereas a Sitka that had windblown could last longer on the ground. Where would you fit in hardwood into that? I agree with what Neil was saying. Some of it, I've got a lot of old beech that's sort of, probably not fit for furniture. But then if you've got good hardwood, should that be prioritized because that's the most valuable? So those are a couple of thoughts. And then a question for Cameron about what he thinks this will do to prices. Because the context at the start, which I was surprised at, is that if this is only 15 to 20% of an annual harvest, then in the big scheme of things, and the stuff ain't going to be coming out of these woods anytime soon, how much do you think it's going to suppress what has been quite strong prices? Thank you.
Cameron, would you like to answer some of those?
Yes, if I start in order, so machinery and availability of harvesters, you're absolutely right. That resource has been stretched for the last 18 months, and we've seen quite a lot of reduction in the harvesting capacity. But I think there's an issue here, and I think there will be availability as woodland owners start to assess the extent of the damage on their properties. You're going to review the felling plans going forward, and what might have been on the plan to do in 2022 is going to be put on the back burner, and the focus will be on windblow. And we still haven't got full visibility yet, and will be some time until we do, to actually work out where the pressure points are. Quite where we go with harvesting going forward, we as a company are running trainee and apprenticeship programs now. One of the biggest limitations is operator availability. So that ultimately is the factor that we see as being most limiting and are trying to address. So I'm not going to say it's easy and there's an abundance of them, but we have found in the last week that we have mobilized machines very quickly. And from calls last Monday morning, I've had machines on site the following Friday. Some sites are not priorities. Some sites can be put on the back burner. The priority at the moment is opening up access roads, removing the risk to public roadsides particularly. And once access roads are open, then people can get in, owners can get in, forestry consultants can get in and have a more accurate assessment of what the actual impact of the blow has been. So I think longer term, I think we will readjust what the 2022 felling program is going to be, and then apply the resource to the higher priority areas. As we touched on earlier, Sitka spruce on the root plate is not going to come to any harm over a 12-month period. So it's just about prioritizing where we go, and that then perhaps leads on to, you said, the higher priority sites. So you're right, Scots pine, come springtime, sap will be starting to move. Pine, if it's not cleared and marketed within a 6-month period, will start to degrade in so much as blue stain will have an effect on its value. So that's one that I would put at the top of the list, out with any health and safety pressures that may exist. And then working through larch is pretty resilient, whether that's snapped or blown. What you'll suffer from if it's not harvested quickly in the springtime, early summer, is weight loss and drying out, but it's still quite a resilient crop. And then back to spruce on the root plate, I would put as the least pressured. In terms of hardwood, an interesting one, because whilst a lot of the parkland and the big open grown mature hardwoods have been blown down, and as Neil touched on earlier, markets for that will be difficult. However, if it's high value, let's say sycamore, for example, and figured sycamore, the prime time to fell that is during the winter when the sap's down. So it's not. Had this been in the middle of summer, I might have been inclined, and it was blown sycamore, to leave it until the sap had stopped flowing. But given that the prime time now is for sycamore would be winter time, then that's perhaps a focus. Oak, high quality oak, it's not going to matter whether you do it in the springtime or the summertime from a valuation point of view. So
just to add, I think all the hardwood whitewood, so sycamore, ash and beech, Cameron's pointed out, now would be the normal time which they're being felled. So as tragic as it is that many of these big trees are lying on their back, from the point of view of their potential timber value, now's a good time of year for it to have happened.
My question is, are they happy to sit there for 2 or 3 years when you're prioritizing a huge clear up operation? And my second question to Cameron was about what he thinks it'll do to prices.
Yeah, if the trees are snapped, then I think your decision's made. You need to get them cleared up as quickly as possible and try and recover whatever value you can. If they're on the stump and they're coming into leaf and the sap's moving, then you've got time on your hands. But things such as the whitewoods particularly are ones that I would focus on now. Oak is not going to come to any harm provided it has not snapped. In terms of what it'll do to the values, we have, over the last month, 5 weeks or so, we've seen quite a significant reduction in the value of timber in comparison to where we were at the beginning of this year. That doesn't mean to say that the market's collapsed. There's been a readjustment. Prices are back. Supply has finally caught up with demand. So the large volumes of timber marketed earlier in the year have now fed through, and people are sitting with high stocks of timber. Inevitably, the price comes back. Because the 2022 felling program will not go ahead as planned, this volume of timber, a proportion of it, and certainly in Scotland, is going to need felling license applications. That means that it's not going to come onto the market in huge quantities next week or in January. There's a process to go through, and that's going to delay its release. So people will readjust. There is going to be an additional volume in there. It will impact on price. I can't give you any indication on what that'll be. I don't see it causing a price collapse, because this will filter through. It won't all come forward in one foul swoop. It will take time to mobilize, and it will take time to plan.
Thank you very much, Cameron. That's very helpful to us. I think we'll move on with questions now, because we've got a few and it is sort of 5 minutes too. So we've got one here from, I think it's from Lewis, is that right?
Louis, yeah, Louis.
iPhone Louis, hi. Do you want to ask a question? Thanks.
I was just asking, how quickly will the Forestry Commission turn around felling licence applications? And then secondly, do we need to apply for planning permission for putting in access tracks and any hard standings for abstraction purposes?
Yeah. Happy to take that. And I noticed Rob Mayhew's on the call. He might want to come in on the planning side of things. Without, I don't want to be seen to be avoiding the question at all, but my answer is it depends, and it really does. It depends on whether it's a conditional license or an unconditional license. It depends on the quality of the information that we initially get from the applicant. Because if the quality of the information is not good, if the map's not good, if the information doesn't stack up on the application form, then there's inevitably a bit of a toing and froing between the Forestry Commission Woodland officer and the the landowner or their agent that submitted it. So it's difficult to give a precise figure. If one assumes that we're still going through the 28-day period on the public register, you remember I said earlier that in some circumstances we might relax that. But if we are doing that, then I would suggest you ought to work on the basis of 8 to 12 weeks as a minimum in terms of the turnaround time of felling license. In terms of whether do you need planning permission, well, forest roads are classed as permitted development, and by forest roads I mean roads within a forest that are for forest purposes, or roads within a woodland that are forestry purposes are classed as permitted development. There are some exceptions though. So when that road is exiting onto a public highway, planning permission is normally required. So a track within a wood, normally permitted development. So you have to notify the local planning authority through the permitted development process, but it doesn't require full-blown planning permission unless there are some specific reasons why it should, one of which is you're exiting onto a highway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Richard, sorry to interrupt. Richard, just on the back of that, is it worth just highlighting access to woodlands, stacking areas in particular, and just to be clear, the provision for stacking areas needs to be considered and needs to be in place before we start to plan the recovery of the wind blow. No longer can we stack timber on the verge of a public highway. So we need to think about that. We need to think and plan for those works to be done in advance of any harvesting.
Yeah, really good advice. I mean, for reasons of road safety, we don't want to be seeing huge stacks of timber on the side of a road and a lorry parked on the road. Particularly, just around a bend, car comes around, crashes into lorry. It's just not good practice. So Cameron's absolutely right. Think about where you're going to stack that timber. If it's an adjacent field in which a lorry can get to, that's great. But very often you'll need to arrange things, certainly in a larger woodland, so you can get that lorry off the road adjacent to where the timber's stacked in a safe position in order to load that wagon and then move out. So factor that in. Sorry, just another quick one that people might be thinking about. It's not been a question asked directly, but it's something that I'm sure will come up. Many of the woodlands that people have now got windblow in, we are funding through the Countryside Stewardship Higher Tier Scheme. And you might be wondering, what happens to those plans? What happens to the arrangement that you've got with the Forestry Commission, for example, to pay you money every year for the management of those woodlands? Now half that woodland is blown down, okay? So the answer to that question is, this is the kind of situation where normally a force majeure would apply. So if you feel you cannot deliver on what you're contractually obliged to deliver on through your higher tier agreement, number one, I would suggest speak to your woodland officer. Number two, write to the RPA referencing force majeure and describing what's happened.
Great. Thank you, Richard. It's 6:01, so you mentioned there that Robert Mayhew, the woodland officer at Northumberland National Park, is on the meeting. Robert, I see you've put your comment in the chat box there, which hopefully people have had time to look at, so thank you very much for that. That's much appreciated. The last question we've got here is actually from Tristan Webb, who's had to leave. I see, Robert, you just turned off here. Is there anything you wanted to add, Robert, before we move on to that?
No, I was just going to say that Richard was spot on there in terms of the permitted development right for forest roads. So it's prior notification that is needed. So in most cases, it's just a notification to the planning authority. The planning authority will make its assessment as to the implications of that proposed new road. If it's deemed to be potentially significant, it may require full planning, but that depends on circumstances. So the prior notification route in relation to planning there, and for TPOs, I put the comment in the comment box there. But again, Richard's spot on. It's They changed that sort of definition recently, so that the word dying has been removed. So it's now dead and dangerous trees may be addressed without the need for a TPO consent. As I said, depending on which planning authority you're dealing with, there may be a requirement to then replace that tree.
Great, thank you, Robert. That's really helpful. So, I've got one more question, which the person asked, who asked it had to leave. So I'm going to ask the question, and then we'll point him towards the answer in the recording. So the question is, and this might be one for Richard or Will possibly. So in the storm, a large ash trunk about 600 mil wide blew down into a field which we were thinking of turning to woodland. I currently have no chainsaw training or machinery. I don't know whether to just leave the tree there, about 1/3 of the root ball remains in the ground, or if it has any commercial value. Access is level ground across 2 fields. Richard, any quick thoughts on that one?
Yeah, really good question. I've got almost the exact same situation on my own land, actually. So I empathise, and many other people will be in this similar kind of situation. I would say that it's very likely, if it's a hedgerow tree, it'll be heavily branched with a short bole, unlikely to be high quality in terms of hardwood timber value. Can't guarantee that, but balance of probability, I'd say that would be unlikely. If there's still a third, if roughly a third of or quarter even of the root plate still in contact, and given that we're in the kind of dormant season for hardwoods, it's not going to come into any harm leaving it for a while. So I would be in absolutely no rush. I certainly wouldn't attempt to tackle it myself. And I certainly wouldn't expect to get hold of a decent gang to deal with it now, because they're still busy clearing roads and getting access for power line operators to do what they need to do to get power back, and various other kind of emergency work. So my advice would be leave it for a while, start making inquiries as to who might be in a place to delimit, take it away, potentially buy it, but don't try and rush it. There's nothing to be gained, I would say, by rushing it, and you're unlikely to get anyone to do it in the short term anyway. Cameron might have something to add in terms of the marketing and who you might contact if you think it might have value beyond firewood. But in terms of the way to approach it, I would deal it like that, and I wouldn't worry about felling license regulations for that one tree that's blown over. You'll be fine on that basis.
Totally agree, Richard. Leave it alone. Don't be tempted to attack it with a chainsaw. I've seen too many horrible outcomes from these things, from that being done. The way it's been described, it's unlikely that it will have any value. It's likely that it will be quite labour intensive to clear. But I would agree with you. Don't rush at it. If you want, I've got people dotted around all over the place. If you want to let me know where it is or where you are, and we can get somebody to have a quick look as we're passing, then happy to do that. But I wouldn't be in any rush.
Great, thank you very much, Cameron and Richard, for that as well. I think I'm going to call it a day there, because it's 6 minutes past 6, and I know people are sort of wanting to get on and do other things. So just to say thank you very much to all of our speakers this evening, to Cameron from Euroforest, thank you for joining us, Richard from the Forestry Commission, Neil from Reheat, if you're still there. Thank you for that. I think it's been a really good evening, a really good conversation, and this is obviously a subject that's, it's going to concern many of us for a long time yet. So the key message, I think, in many respects, is don't rush into something. You need to take your time, take it carefully, and if you're not sure how to do something yourself, then do ask the experts. So with that, I think it's just to say that next week we've got the next one of our sessions. That one is on sort of an introduction to management operations in woodlands, different ways of managing woodlands. For those of you who haven't perhaps managed your woodlands in the past, you may well find that of interest. Do please join us for that. And if there are any sort of follow-up to the the storm issues that we've talked about, we may well have a bit of time to talk about those things as well. So on Will and my behalf, thank you very much. Hope you found it useful. If there's anything else we can help with, do please let us know.
Could I just very quickly ask Martin, you mentioned earlier about it going on YouTube.
Yeah,
I think that's a really good idea, and I think it would be a resource that other people could draw on. I wonder if you could circulate the link in due course.
Yeah, we will do. Thanks for that reminder, Richard. I meant to say that we'll be sending you all a follow up to this, and there will be a link to that once we know exactly where that is, and also some other sources of information. So yeah, thanks for that, Richard. So
thank you.
Yeah. So good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. Bye bye.